everybody, and welcome to this webinar. As many of you know, this year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Process, which was a milestone in the building process of a Mediterranean space of peace, stability and prosperity. Launched in 1995, the Barcelona Process was the first attempt to start building a regional architecture in the Mediterranean, which would bring Europe and its southern Mediterranean neighbors together. It, of course, materialized later in a second phase in what we know today as the UFM, as the Union of the Mediterranean, an ambitious regional forum bringing together 42 member states from Europe on the Mediterranean basis, which has now a permanent secretariat now in Barcelona, where I had the pleasure to serve for many years, and that's the reason why it's also I'm particularly happy of hosting that seminar, and having colleagues and representatives of the UFM, not only but also from the UFM present here with us. Well, we celebrate its achievement, including the launch of the European Neighbourhood Policy in 2004. That was well before the creation of the UFM. This anniversary is also a timely opportunity to reflect on the strategic partnership with the region in light of the current political, socioeconomic, environmental and security challenge that have, of course, multiplied over the last 25 years at the time when the Barcelona Declaration was launched. In order to overcome these challenges, we need a new vision for Euromed cooperation and a renewed ambitious agenda, as it was acknowledged in the recent EU Southern Neighbourhood Ministerial meeting that happened recently. Together with our panel of experts and representatives from the UFM and the European Commission, and I would like also particularly to thank also the European Commission for being with us today. We would like to discuss and identify new opportunities for renewed cooperation between the countries of the two shores of the Mediterranean and give a new political impetus to our shared agenda. I'm organizing this webinar together with my group colleague Jordi Solé, and we both would like to thank all the speakers for being this afternoon with us, for accepting the invitation, and for having a critical look forward to what, and I think what promises to be, I think, a very interesting discussion. So voila, that is the welcoming words on my side. Thank you everybody for being this afternoon here, and without further delay, I'm going to pass the floor to Daniela Huber, Head of the Mediterranean and Middle East Program at the Istituto Affari Internazionali. Daniela, thank you so much for accepting moderating that debate, and she will guide us and moderate into today's discussion. So Daniela, the floor is yours, and thank you again to everybody.
Well, many thanks to you, Ernest, and also to Laura, who organized this, and of course to Jordi Solé. And thank you very much for inviting me to moderate this. This is a topic which is very close to my area of interest. Of course, I have been coordinating a Horizon 2020 project on Euro-Mediterranean relations for 3 years. And indeed, I think it is very timely because to hold this event, as we have just been celebrating the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Process. And of course, these anniversaries also always serve a little bit to take stock of what has actually happened. And if we look at the Barcelona Process or the Euro-Mediterranean Partnership, and together with the European Neighbourhood policies, which followed a few years later, they have, of course, been major EU foreign policy initiatives which reacted to a changed world. So the end of the Cold War and the Oslo Accords for the Barcelona Process, and then the EU enlargement for the neighborhood policy. So the launching of these initiatives happened in reaction to these events, and that also kind of stood in what could be seen as a European foreign policy tradition already, because also the European community beforehand had reacted with milestone initiatives to milestone events, right? So if we just think about the global Mediterranean policy in the 1970s after the 2 Arab-Israeli wars, or also the Venice Declaration in 1980 after the Camp David Accords. So we can see there is actually some continuity. And thinking about this, I think on the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Process, and then also actually the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprising, probably my larger question for today would be if this pattern of EU foreign policy does continue, or if it has maybe be someone losing steam. So my question is, have the UFM and the European neighborhood adjusted to new realities, Or should we even maybe think further about whole new initiatives which react to the groundbreaking and ongoing Arab uprisings and the new geopolitics which followed? Very briefly, I think it's also important to note the larger context of EU foreign policy here now, which speaks of a pragmatic turn in its foreign policy, which seems to commit the European Union currently a little bit more to stability. And at the same time, of course, we noted there's many new conflicts in the Middle East and North Africa, most importantly, maybe Syria and Libya, where I think all analysts who deal with the Middle East and North Africa expected actually more decisive diplomatic initiatives from the EU. There's also Israel-Palestine, where the EU has been a key player over the past decades, but it seems to be a little bit more silent on this issue today. And also, I think that the major new initiatives of the European Union with the new Commission, so the Defense Union and the Green Deal, are maybe a bit more inward-looking than how the EU reacted in the 1990s. So looking at these tendencies on the one hand of the European Union and looking at them in the larger global context, of course, we see that the globe is moving on to a new world. It's either termed a multipolar world or a multiplex world, where other regions are rising and Western modernity is maybe not the single dominant offer on the plate anymore. So in such a new world, the EU needs an answer to this, and particularly it needs an answer to a changed neighborhood where the ongoing Arab revolutions are also driving forward a new political imagination of their future. So 25 years after the Barcelona process, I think this is a very timely webinar to think about the EU vision for Euro-Mediterranean cooperation. And this is really a stellar panel, I would say, to discuss this question in a very unique format, which brings parliamentarians, policymakers and experts together to keep up also the momentum on this question, of course, within the European Union. Now, before I turn to the panelists, I would like to shortly introduce them. You have already listened to the introductory remarks of MEP Ernest Urtasun. He holds an MA in International Relations from the University of Barcelona and held different responsibilities in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation in Spain and abroad. And as he already said, he has been diplomatic advisor to the Secretary General of the Union for the Mediterranean. Since 2014, he is member of the European Parliament for the Greens, the European Free Alliance Group, and he is member of the parliamentary committees on economic and monetary affairs and on women's rights and gender equality, as well as the subcommittee on tax matters and the European Parliament's delegations for relations with Iran. We will then turn to the panel. Marc Sánchez is a Spanish diplomat. After holding several positions within the Spanish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, he served as a diplomatic advisor in the cabinet of the Prime Minister of Spain. Since September 2020, he is deputy head of cabinet at the Union for the Mediterranean. We will then turn to Henrike Trautmann, who is a historian by training and has worked in the European Commission for more than 20 years, focusing on external relations. She has dealt with common foreign and security policy, communication, humanitarian assistance and civil protection, as well as with a number of policy files related to resilience building in fragile countries. Since January 2019, she is responsible for regional programs and cooperation in the Southern Neighborhood in DG NEAR. Since September 2020, she has also assumed the role of acting director for the Southern Neighborhood. We then turn to the discussants. Edward Sola-Ileche is a senior research fellow at CIDOP, the Barcelona Center for International Affairs. Between 2016 and 19, he was scientific coordinator of MENARA, a European project on geopolitical shifts in the Middle East and North Africa. He holds a PhD in international relations from the Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, where he is affiliated as a part-time lecturer. Since 2013, he has also led the El Hiwar project on Europe-Arab diplomacy at the College of Europe in Bruges. And Larissa Komjak is a political scientist specializing on comparative politics of the Middle East and North Africa. She's the director of the Centre d'études maghrébines à Tunis, associate fellow at Chatham House in London, and the founder, together with Gillian Schwedler, of the Sidi Bou Said School of Critical Protest Studies. She's also the author of the forthcoming book, Archipelagos of Dissent, Protests and Politics in Tunisia. Finally, MEP Jordi Solé will give closing remarks. He holds an MA in European Studies, and since 2011, he is the responsible for international relations of his political party. In March 2012, he became the Secretary General of the European Free Alliance. He currently is a member of the European Parliament of the Greens European Free Alliance group, and he sits on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Subcommittee on Human Rights, the Delegation for Relations with the Maghreb countries, and the delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Union for the Mediterranean. So many thanks to all of you for joining us. Now, before I start the discussion, I want to say to the audience, to everyone who is watching, that you can, during the whole webinar, ask your questions in the question and answer panel. We will first have the panel and then the last part for Q&A, but I will look at it all the time, so you can already ask questions while the webinar is moving. Now, to start our discussion, there has recently been an EU Southern Neighbourhood Ministerial meeting to discuss how best to move forward to renew the European Neighbourhood Policy. And this meeting was then also followed by the UFM's Regional Forum. So I would first like to ask Marc Sánchez and Henrike Trautmann if you could maybe explain to us what has happened in these meetings, what has been discussed, where we stand in terms of both initiatives, so the neighborhood policy and the Union for the Mediterranean, and which ideas are emerging for future cooperation. Marc, you could maybe give us an overview of the Barcelona process and the scenarios for the futures, and Henrike, you could step in to talk about EU involvement in the region through the renewed southern dimension of the neighborhood policy. So please, Marc, the word is yours. Thank you.
So good afternoon, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very timely meeting. Indeed, 2 weeks ago, we held the, the 5th UFM, so Union for the Mediterranean Regional Forum, back-to-back with a ministerial meeting from the European Union and its southern neighbors. That was 26th, 27th of November. This was to celebrate the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Process that was launched, as Ernest said before, back in Barcelona in 1995. And I will try and divide my intervention in two parts. In the first part, I will try and take stock of what's been going on for these 25 years, what the result of this Euro-Mediterranean cooperation has been so far. While in the other side, in the second part, I will try and draw up a series of scenarios for the future that I think may be unfolding before us. So if we take into consideration what the objective back in 1995 was, this was to create an area for peace, stability, shared prosperity, and then human, social, and cultural exchange. This was supposed to be attained by working on 3 different working areas, the so-called baskets of the Barcelona Declaration. The first was to advance in terms of political cooperation and security, and that meant essentially 2 things. First of all, advancing in the development of democracy, rule of law, and human rights for all countries in both shores, and at the same time trying and secure a region, a stabilization and security for the region. The second basket was economic and financial cooperation, and this in turn meant 2 things. First of all, the cooperation between the European Union and the southern countries through essentially, but not limited to, financial assistance, and at the same time, the establishment of a whole Euro-Mediterranean free trade area. Now, the third basket was intended to create this vivid exchange between civil societies in terms of social exchange, human and cultural. Where do we find ourselves today, 25 years later on? Well, first of all, let me say that I will not try to explain why we find ourselves in this situation. I think scholars are much more qualified to say that. I will merely try and lay out some of the facts that I think draw a rather grim picture of the situation nowadays, And if we take into consideration what the three baskets were, I think we can unfold these results. The first of all is, well, I have to say that one of the baskets where we advanced the most was the third one. So the building of an area for shared experiences and mutual understanding, and the very existence of the Annalyn Foundation is living proof to that. But if we take into consideration the political and security basket, well, we are far from the objective marked back in '95. There have been few advancements in the political scene, and in terms of security, we have today ongoing wars in Syria and Libya, despite recent developments on those two fields, by the way. But we also have tensions rising in Eastern Mediterranean, and we, of course, have the Middle East peace process, which is ongoing as of today. I have to say that if we have a look at the economic situation and this, therefore, second basket, the situation is as well not very promising, I have to say. Some data regarding this: we have a huge gap nowadays between the north and the south of the Mediterranean, whereby countries in the south have a GDP per capita that is 13 times lower than in the north. Meaning that in these countries, almost none of them attains $2,000 US per capita. Let me say as well that unemployment is surging in the region. We're peaking at about 14.6% for the entire southern region, and this is particularly affecting youth and women. Youth because about 30% of people from 15 to 24 years old are unemployed, and in terms of women, it is calculated that 40 to 50% of women in these countries are currently unemployed. Now, there is also an extremely limited economic and trade integration in the region. The objective in '95 was to create this area of free trade for the entire region. Instead, we only had the Euro-Mediterranean Association agreements with all of those countries except for Libya and Syria. And still, this essentially cover trade in goods, but not in services or investments. And even in goods, these are limited, although I know there are ongoing negotiations to strengthen them up. The current situation is, as I was saying, that we have very limited trade integration. Out of the total trade flow in the whole of the Euro-Mediterranean region, 90% is basically north-north trade, 1% is south-south, and 9% is north-south. But still, out of that 9%, we are facing a situation with a huge trade imbalance that affects mostly the south, whereby 70 billion euros of trade deficit can be seen in this relation from the south. If we add to this a climate emergency that we're facing, and there was this MEDEC report at the beginning of this year that showed that the Euro-Mediterranean region is warming up 20% faster than any other region in the world. We have quite a grim scenario that will be worsened, by the way, by COVID-19. Not only in social terms, but especially in economic terms, first of all, because of the plunging in oil prices that we've seen already, of tourism and of investment. In the way that, well, forecasts say that the GDP will contract by 5% in the southern Mediterranean countries. So yes, the assessment is so far cruel, I'm afraid I have to say, and it is not me saying it. It's the HR VP Josep Borrell, who mentioned during the regional forum that the Euro-Mediterranean region is in a worse shape today than it was 25 years ago. Also, another quote from the regional meeting in Barcelona was Nasser Bouritas, a Moroccan foreign affairs minister, saying that we were not there to blow out the candles. And yet, I think there is room for optimism. I think that the very acknowledgement of this grim situation, of this bad assessments 25 years later is building up political momentum and is sort of operating as a wake-up call for political actors in the region. I think there is a political momentum that we can make use of. I think there is a window of opportunity opening, and I think there are some strategies that can be followed. So let me now try and lay out the 3 scenarios that I think we could be facing in the upcoming years. And I think I will have to classify them from less to more optimistic. The less optimistic scenario is obviously business as usual. And this essentially means that the political situation in the Middle East is essentially blocking the development of what the process of the Barcelona process can achieve. This situation creates a paradox nowadays, as it did actually 25 years ago, even though the momentum was better then. This paradox means that on the one hand, this is an issue, a political issue that is extremely high on the agenda, but it is at the same time extremely difficult to resolve, and particularly in a forum like the UFM, which is no forum for these kind of negotiations. But on the other side, the fact that this is so high on the agenda prevents the Union for the Mediterranean from being able to concentrate strongly and putting in more efforts and resources into development projects and actions that the UFM could undertake. The second scenario is a moderate scaling up. And I have to say that for this, there is one requirement which is essentially encapsulating the most sensitive political issues, so that the Union for the Mediterranean can concentrate in a series of key priorities that are at the same time that affect strongly in development and socioeconomic terms, but that have as well a huge political impact on the medium and the long run. And these key priority areas were actually identified by a co-presidency statement at the end of the regional forum in Barcelona. These are environment and climate action, as well as the protection of biodiversity, as well as inclusive sustainable development through job creation, through fostering investments in the region, as well as trade and economic integration, and of course working on the potential of the blue economy. This also means social equality and integration, especially regarding gender equality, but also the empowerment of the youth, digital transformation, and last but not least, civil protection, which is sort of a new aspect that owes obviously to the emergence of the COVID, and that opens a whole series of prospects for the process of Barcelona to step into. This second scenario would also require scaling up of the involvement of the European Union. And this, although the representative from the European Commission will be able to enlighten us on this, I think that this can take 2 different paths. The first would be that this redimensioning of the southern dimension of the European neighborhood policy would be operated in such a strong way that the projects particularly important for the region would be toughened up, and particularly if this redimensioning has a regional aspect and not only a bilateral aspect. The second path would be that the Green Deal has and finally develops, which is maybe ongoing in negotiations between in the middle of the European Commission, but not still the case as far as I know, a external dimension. Because whatever happens in terms of the environment and the climate in the Mediterranean region, so the immediate neighborhood of the European Union, invariably affects the whole of the European Union. Now, finally, a third and maybe the most ambitious scenario would be that the Union for the Mediterranean reinforces its capacities, both financially through a dedicated instrument or a fund, things that were actually talked about during the regional forum, but also in terms of the management capacities that the UFM has. So beyond labeling projects of development cooperation, the UFM could also step up and manage those projects to a certain extent, either directly or through a foundation or a center. This would also mean that the UFM could start working on politically sensitive issues, namely security issues, migration flows, and the integration of migrants. The objectives, the objective in the end being that this creates an atmosphere, an environment for political mutual comprehension, the easiness of regional tensions, and therefore the bringing up of stability in the entire region. So all in all, and as a conclusion, I would say that there is room for opportunity and for optimism. Minister Arantxa González Laya from Spain said that the commitment was clear after the 25th anniversary of the UFM to pour political energy into the Barcelona process. And I honestly don't think, I don't see any member state out of the 42 of the Union for the Mediterranean that would be actively interested in business being conducted as usual. I rather think that if a group of countries boldly moves from both the north and the south into cooperating and leveling up this ambition, I think the rest will sooner or later jump on the bandwagon and follow. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks so much to you, Marc. I think this has been an excellent regional perspective indeed, starting indeed from the need for having a security architecture in the region and addressing the huge economic imbalances in the region, which is also things that came out very clearly actually in my research project. And then moving on to the future scenarios, which I think have been very interesting, and for sure also the Edward and Larissa will have some input on that. And I was particularly happy to hear that actually issues such as migration are moving higher on the agenda, because again, in my research project, that was one of the main issues that came across as separating the Mediterranean. So thank you very much for this. And now we turn more to the European neighborhood policy, and to Henrike, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and good afternoon to everybody. Thanks a lot to Ernest and Jordi for organizing this very, very timely discussion, I think, because as I already explained, it comes 2 weeks after the 25th, the official 25th anniversary of the Barcelona Convention, but it also comes at a moment where, certainly from our point of view, we do have a new momentum for the southern neighborhood. We really have a moment, and I really talk now very much as a commission official, but also in the discussion around, it's very much back on the agenda. And for a long time, I think there has been a feeling both in the north, particularly the northern member states which are bordering the Mediterranean, but also particularly in the south, that it wasn't sufficiently on the agenda, and that the East and the Western Balkans and the Far East and a number of other things are more important. And we're not really paying attention enough to our immediate neighbors in the south, which are of strategic importance. So I think that's the first good news, that there is this renewed attention, and that there is an interest in the region as a strategic partner. And I'm saying this upfront because I know it will come up, not only as a strategic partner or strategic reason because of migration flows. I mean, that is obviously an issue, and that's a backdrop to a lot of what is being discussed, but it is not the only issue. And I think we have to be very careful to make sure that this is understood. And that's why I would like to talk through a couple of initiatives that are ongoing now on the level of the European Commission. I mean, obviously, and Daniela touched upon it in her introduction, there is a huge amount of things that relate to the southern neighborhood. We could talk hours on the Middle East peace process, we could talk about Libya, we could talk about Syria, we could talk about a lot of things. And obviously there is parallel initiatives ongoing. There is a hope on the side of the institutions that maybe with the new US administration, there could also be a window of opportunity to revitalize the MEPP. Maybe new discussions on Syria, but I don't plan to go into all that because that would go way beyond the scope of this seminar, but really try to see where we're in the Commission trying to push for some concrete translation of this new momentum into something tangible, both for the EU, but also for the southern neighbors. So, I mean, and there, of course, the pandemic is a vital part. You know, a year ago, we wouldn't have had the same discussion at all. And the indeed very, very bleak description of Marc of the situation in the southern neighborhood, not only also on the north side of the Mediterranean, but particularly in the countries bordering the Mediterranean, which has already been difficult in many cases before, even in the stable countries. but is of course made much more difficult by the consequences of the pandemic, which are only now starting to roll out because we're basically still in the middle of it. Economic consequences, clearly loss of GDP, but also a very stark reminder that some of the economies have been heavily relying on certain sectors and are not sufficiently diversified into other areas, you know, be it tourism, be it generally service hospitality industry, be it export of certain products, be it, you know, reliance, as in the case of some countries, on fossil fuel exportations. This all, of course, has functioned for a long time, but we clearly see that it can't be the only thing. It's not something which will allow a sustainable recovery after the end of this pandemic. And I think it's also in our southern partner countries brought home the fact that this inward-looking non-integration of the region is also increasingly becoming a problem, because it does block trade opportunities. It blocks a number of economic and investment opportunities in certain areas, for example, digital services, certainly transport and infrastructure integration, very, very complicated. And that blocks the development of the region. And here I talk a little bit more about North Africa than I talk about the Middle East. But it blocks the development and the opportunities for integrated value chains and for really linking up with larger economic development on a global level. Because as we all know, so far it's all been south-north, so there's a strong relationship amongst some countries with the EU, including as trade partners, but there is not enough integration in terms of trading across the region, or in terms of looking further and looking also at the opportunities. So in the Commission, we think that, you know, as bad as the situation may be, it also has an opportunity, and it has the opportunity to really have another look at how it can develop in the future, and how the growth that has been quite impressive in the cases of some of the countries in the region can also translate into jobs. Because that, we all realize, will be the main important aspect in the years to come. We have to be able to translate growth into sustainable jobs and perspectives for young people, not only for young people, but mainly we have to be able to use the very well educated workforce that is present in the region, you know, that knows languages, connected to Europe, that is not far from Europe, how to give them a possibility to function in the countries, and to also get involved in economic development through startups, through entrepreneurship, through a number of initiatives where the EU will hopefully be in a possibility to help. There, of course, the main priorities of the von der Leyen commissions are coming into it, and I actually don't think they're only inward-looking. I mean, they're in the first instance inward-looking, like the Green Deal, for example, but it's clear that the Green Deal is not going to function if it's completely only looking at the EU. The southern Mediterranean countries, indeed very much touched by climate change consequences and very close to Europe, will have to be part of that. And it gives them enormous opportunities, at least to some of them. If you look at the possibilities of renewable energy, if you look at the possibilities of green hydrogen, for example, countries like Morocco and increasingly Egypt are already now leaders in these areas. And there is a lot of interest from the EU side for investment, and for also helping the EU transition into a green and sustainable economy through working with these partners. So the idea is very much to look at these opportunities, to look at ways of putting the Green Deal into action in the South, also digital approaches. And then what is now known under this slightly new buzzword, if I may say, nearshoring, to see how the possibilities of and the wish of the EU to, you might call it strategic autonomy, or you might call it other things, but basically the very clear wish of the EU countries to bring things back closer to home, to shorten the global supply chains, to make sure that we're not completely dependent on things that happen in China or in Malaysia, but that there's production capacities, that there is knowledge and possibilities much closer to home. And there, the countries of the region are a priori in a good position to benefit from that. And now we have to make it happen. So as already mentioned, there is the European Neighborhood Policy, which has been in force in its renewed version since 2015. We don't plan to revise that again because basically it's not seen as something which is not applicable anymore. But the plan is to really add a new focus and maybe a sharpening of some of the policy areas of the ENP with an upcoming communication, which is being jointly prepared by the HRVP and Commissioner Varela. So it's a joint communication between the Commission and the EAS, very much focusing on this renewed partnership with the South. It will include a kind of economic investment initiative where we're now looking into designing tailor-made packages for the different countries of the region, which of course will have to take into account what their capacities and their wishes and their possibilities in the next couple of years are. So the differentiation principle that's already embedded in the ENP, of course, continues to apply, and it's clear that a country like Morocco is in a different place than a country like Libya. But if changes in Libya indeed come about in the next couple of months and years, then maybe very quickly they will equally be in a different position, and we need to be prepared to be able to react to that. So what we've done from the side of certainly my commissioner is that we started to reach out to the governments of the region through, given the current pandemic conditions, through VTCs, but he's also been recently on a mission to Morocco. We've basically asked them what they want, and then we'll see what we can do about that. So the idea is to come up with a number of flagship projects per country, to look at a number of initiatives also on a sectoral level, very much integrating the aspects of the new von der Leyen priorities into our southern partner relationships, and basically bring all this together in a Commission communication, which normally should be adopted around first quarter of 2021. Following this, we will hopefully have an agreement on the new MFF and the new single instrument, the NDICI, and that means that we have the firepower, if you wish, to roll out some of these ideas over the next 7 years. Very important, we will not only work through the classical grant assistance budget support, we will also be able to work much more through investment approaches with the private sector, on blending, working on guarantee schemes, together with the international and European financing institutions, which allows to leverage much more money that the European Commission than the European Union actually has available in the next MFF, and that should help with some of the larger ideas coming out of here. One last point before I hand back to Daniela. I think it's also important to know that it's not only the external relations DGs in the Commission who are working on these issues. You might be aware that DG Trade is currently preparing a large trade policy review. And there also we see a lot of interest from our trade colleagues on trying to integrate questions of southern neighborhood, trade integration, PEM and other possibilities of really bringing them closer to us and giving us an opportunity to also develop perspectives long-term for the countries in the region and for the people who live there. I will stop with that and happy to take any questions you might have. Thank you.
Many thanks to you, Henrike. I think this gave us a very good overview where this is going, and I understand that at the heart of the new efforts will be trade, economic development, and sustainability questions. Yes, and on the Green Deal, I think that's also something that is something that will clearly evolve, which I think interests us all a lot. And probably my view would be that it's important to not only look at it from an investment basis and exporting European technology, but taking account of local needs in the Middle East and North Africa, and work with local groups which are fighting for ecological justice and rights. So I think that's an important approach. And maybe adding on to what you said, I thought it was also interesting to see that there was a new European initiative in the direction of human rights and democracy with the Human Rights and Democracy Action Plan, and also with the sanctions mechanisms, which has been passed, I think, by the Foreign Affairs Council 2 days ago. So that's also something interesting to watch out what will happen in this respect. So thank you so much. This has been a really good overview. I would now turn to the discussion side, and I think that Edward and Larissa can just really comment also on anything they heard, but I also had some particular questions. For Edward in particular, I would be interested to shed more light maybe on the perspectives from the side of the European Union, where I think the dominant lens to look at the Mediterranean might still be influenced by the principled pragmatism paradigm, but might also be changing a little bit. And I think it has, what we have witnessed also was a lack of cohesion, often contradictory policies of member states. And in the EU, we also witnessed the rise of nationalist populist forces, which also have obviously an impact on European foreign policy towards the Mediterranean in the area of migration, for example. So I would be interested if you could shed light on these issues more from the European side of view, and also maybe think about how a new vision for the Mediterranean could also have a positive impact on Europe itself, actually. So Edward, the floor is yours.
Let's try. So the first thing, when in looking at the European approach towards the Mediterranean, I think that here it's really useful to compare 1995 with the year 2020. 1995, it was an incredible moment of optimism, and there were many reasons not to be optimist. I mean, remember the situation in Algeria in the 90s, or the situation in the former Yugoslavia, and yet there was this idea, this spirit that things could change, that the region could be transformed, and that the EU could play a key role in transforming the region and the relation between the citizens and the countries around the region. So it was a moment also not only of optimism, but also of ambition, where the Mediterranean became a synonym of cooperation. And where, as I said, the European Union and its member states and its societies perceive themselves as strong and able to project strength. Year 2020. I think that you may agree with me that if there is a dominant feeling, is the feeling of fear, even more in a year like 2020. There is also the accumulation of frustrations because, as also Marc was saying, the goals of 1995 were not achieved. Frustration also with the results of this emancipatory wave that was the Arab uprisings. And also where the Mediterranean has become less of a synonym of cooperation, despite the efforts of all the colleagues in the Commission, in the Ministries of Foreign Affairs, in the Union for the Mediterranean. But when citizens or journalists report on the Mediterranean, they generally report on competition, geopolitical competition around the Mediterranean, now mainly in the eastern basin of the Mediterranean, or even conflict, or the risk of conflict. And also a moment where we Europeans, we have too often project weakness rather than strength. And we have had too many occasions where our partners and our neighbors have perceived the EU as being too weak, too afraid. This also is not helping to build this new positive transformational agenda for the Mediterranean. And that's why I think that there is a lot of homework to be done internally in the EU, in each of our member states, in each of our societies, if we really need to go into this transformational project. Because it's not, I mean, it's a necessary condition to have the good, valid ideas that Marc and Henrike were putting on the table on how we could have a transformational agenda again on the table that we want to share with the necessary firepower, as Henrike said. It is not enough if we are not also able to project strength. It could be worse. It could be worse because if you think about what many people were expecting about how the EU could react to the pandemic back in April or May, that was a moment of panic. And we've seen that lessons have been learned, that if we've been able to come together, that we can have the necessary ambition and also the necessary firepower. So as I said, I mean, still, I mean, now in December 2020, the situation is a little bit more promising than what it was a few months ago. And hopefully this is building on the momentum that Henrike was describing. Also, it's 25th anniversary of the Barcelona process. That's very important. But in the next few months, the conversation will be mainly about the 10th anniversary of the Arab uprisings. And also then it's not the unfulfilled goals of the Barcelona process, but the unmet expectations of our neighbors in the South, I mean, the societies in the South. And we have to integrate all this into our discussion. And now that I was listening to Henrike about the joint communication to be made public, I guess around February or March, isn't it, Henrike? I mean, it reminded me also of the fact that back in 2010, we had also started the process of review of the ENP. I was back then in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Madrid, where I met Ernest at that time also. And I remember also how suddenly, I mean, everyone was caught by surprise by the Arab uprisings, and we had to change all the plans that we had about what we wanted to do with the ENP, and that's how we came with the communications of March and May 2011. I mean, well, we know that, as I said, the reasons that led people to protest in 2010 and 2011, both in the north and the south of the Mediterranean, are still there. And we also know that, I mean, that the protests that started in 2019 in many Arab countries have been under lockdown. But this will change at some point also in 2021. So one of the things that I think that we need to take into account here, I'm very curious to know what Larissa may have to say, is not only to incorporate, I mean, these homeworks of what we should do, the things that we have to do at home, but also to be more attentive of these signals, sometimes strong signals, sometimes weak signals that are arriving from the societies in the southern Mediterranean. So let me close with this idea. I think that we, as Europeans, if we want to build a more positive and transformative vision for the Mediterranean, we have to be stronger. We have to be credible. That also, if we speak about rule of law and human rights outside, we need to be credible also inside. And we also need to be inclusive. We are building all these transformational projects that we've been referring to, the Green Deal, the digital agenda, the strategic autonomy. Well, let's open up to our neighbors to be part also of this transformational project, while taking into consideration the changes that are occurring at the global level, and also to the signals of discontent that may be arriving from our southern neighbors. So I'll finish here for the first remarks. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Edward. I think that summed it up very well. I would probably add also, in fact, the issue of social justice to the issue of inclusivity, particularly when it comes to the area of trade, development, investments, etc. I think that's really crucial, but probably Larissa has much more to say about this. If I can just already tell the audience, really, there are no questions so far, but if you want, you can already ask them in the question and answer function. Now, for Larissa, I would be more interested to know the perspective from the Southern Mediterranean. So on the one hand, what do you think are the main political trends beyond violent conflict in the Southern Mediterranean that are critical for envisioning a renewed North-South partnership? And what does political contention and protest movements tell us about the status quo that we have now and alternative conceptions of governance? And finally, I would also be interested to know what does the future of the EU-North Africa relationship hold? So Larissa, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Daniela and Laura and Ernest and Jordi for organizing this discussion today. It's great to see everyone we felt a bit disconnected for other reasons that are not related to the some of the critical comments that I'm going to raise. I think that my comments are, a lot of them are going to be about protest and contention, but they fit, I think they fit well into the issue that Marc brought up about the huge economic gap between North and South, and then also the unmet expectations that Edward touched upon. And I have divided my comments into 3 responses, responding to your question. So regarding the first question about the major political trends, I should also tell the audience that I'm going to draw heavily on examples from North Africa and specifically Tunisia, where I live and work as well. So I can discuss, other cases as well, but this is basically where my observations are coming from. So there are 2, I think, critical trends that have defined the Southern Mediterranean region over the last decade. And one of them is sustained social protest, which is something we didn't witness before the 2011 Arab uprising. And the second trend is a fortified and more violent form of authoritarianism. Those 2 forms are closely linked in that repression of freedoms by governments, together with the inability to meet social service and social justice promises, has created a very complicated political scenario, which I want to highlight for the purposes of our discussion today and to kind of envision how to move forward. The idea here is not that these things can be fixed or that these ideas take central stage, but that they are major trends that are defining that relationship in the Southern Mediterranean. For years, the question of authoritarianism in the Middle East broadly has oftentimes been reduced to the repressive political apparatuses of the states, with less attention to the political economy of repression. In other words, the question was, how do relative resource poor countries have been able to sustain authoritarian rule and direct public funds into their durability? So historically, the West has lent support to these regimes through financial assistance to defense, policing, security, and migration prevention programs, and often limited developmental programming to regime-authorized, if not regime-friendly initiatives. Over the last decade, sustained social protests across the region have revealed this tension. And as I will speak about in just a moment, have also mapped on a global geography of protest. So what is going on in the Southern Mediterranean, in the Middle East, is not disconnected from Europe, but has a global logic to it as well. What citizens in the southern shore of the Mediterranean are demanding is not different from other places, like in Peru and Chile, South Africa, India, what they're calling for, which is social justice, as Daniela pointed out, and socioeconomic rights, the redistribution of concentrated wealth and reduction of inequalities, environmental protection, food and health safety, and a meaningful fight against corruption. The protestatory movements that I'm especially interested in, but that have also taken a political center stage, highlight these contradictions, in the sense that in a world of shrinking budgetary resources, autocrats cannot deliver on their own distributional promises and simultaneously collect these basic demands to what citizens, especially younger generations, are demanding worldwide. For North Africa, I like to root these moments and these ideas in the 2008 international financial crisis, which occurred 12 years ago and obviously preceded the Arab Spring by 2 years, and connected to the more recently falling oil price, which squeezed authoritarian regimes that were forced to cut more social spending. This is a principal part of the story that explains the mobilization, also the frustration that inspired the 2011 revolutions and continues to inspire frustration across the region. So some examples since then: Morocco has steadily become more authoritarian, entrenched in a neoliberal paradigm. In Algeria, the 2019 Hirak protests were as much a result of perceptions of declining living standards as opposition to President Bouteflika's fifth mandate. In Tunisia, the authoritarian fell in 2011 when Ben Ali was deposed, though the new democratic system was immediately confronted with economic crisis, requiring the intervention of international financial institutions, or IFI, and leading to a political impasse that has lasted to this day. In Egypt, the regime collapsed, but from its ashes arose a new dictatorship, which has doubled down on repression, cut public services, and is fully engaged in IFI reforms. Of course, our conversation today is about the Mediterranean, but the question at hand, the rethinking of a meaningful partnership across shores, cannot be divided from critical global shifts. That is, the rise of right-wing populism, as well as the neoliberalization of democracy. Thus, one critical area for meaningful and continued cooperation is to point out how and why these regimes are able to maintain, sustain, and entrench authoritarian rule. Or why is the right wing getting so much traction globally, especially in established democracies? And I don't think that these questions are necessarily disconnected. And so one way to think about these is an area of really important cooperation. This, I believe, first requires scrutiny of the intricacies of defense security coordination and related development programs, but also addressing the elephant in the room, which many people don't like to talk about, the impact of the IFIs on the burgeoning debt crisis that has overtaken the majority of the national budget portfolios of poor countries. So Tunisia is facing big protests right now because well over 70% of its national budget is allocated to servicing debt. And so a place that is considered to be the only democracy in the region coming out of the Arab Spring cannot deliver on social service promises when they're ensnared deeply in debt and lending programs. I think it's clear that I'm very interested in the study of protests, and I think that we can learn a lot. We can view politics through that lens and kind of learn what is going well and what is not going well. So one trend that has distinguished the North Africa and the Middle East region today from 10 years ago is that protests have become the norm, both in democratic and non-democratic system. 2019 was labeled not just by Time magazine, but others as well as the Global Year of Protest. Though in many ways, I think that 2020 has been a much more intense year. And countries like Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia did not buck this trend. Through the lens of protest across the region, in the Hirak movements in both Algeria and Morocco, and especially in Tunisia, where protests register at well over 10,000 per year. So that's about somewhere between 35 and 40 protests per day. We can see the complexity of demands. Many development and assistance programs over the last decade have taken on a version of economic determinism by reducing demands to jobs. And I think that Henrike actually pointed out that this is a lot more complex than just creating jobs. So even though this has created a very powerful discourse in which deeply structural grievances are equated to simple economic demands, in the simplest of terms, people are not asking for just jobs. They're demanding jobs for dignified and secured lives. And those are two very different things. Like protests elsewhere in the world, especially as a response to the rise of right-wing political systems and the crisis of liberal democracy, citizens are calling for much broader and much larger and much radical transformations. Here, citizens are increasingly imagining alternative systems of governance, whether regime transformations as in Algeria, Morocco, or as in Tunisia, a thicker notion of democracy that replaces electoral minimalism with comprehensive, just, and egalitarian notions of governance. In Tunisia, the celebrated democratic success story, protest movements are vast, calling on different radical changes from debt restructuring to dignified employment, human security, comprehensive systems of social security, especially public health services, this which lasts pre-pandemic, environmental grievances from access to clean water, pollution, and food security have secured regular places on protest maps. Most movements are also touching on corruption, both in government and among powerful business elites, or at the intersections of those two. So it is around these incredibly dynamic demands for reform that meaningful cooperation can be envisioned. What distinguishes the Southern Mediterranean from the North, where class issues and grievances are not radically different, is the South's dependence on aid and assistance programs, and also its noxious combination of neoliberalism, heavy-handed security policy, and exclusionary political rule. So the entire system looks different, even though the grievances are very similar. What does this mean for the future relationship between the EU and the region, and especially the EU and the Maghreb and North Africa? So since 2011, both Southern and Northern member states in this relationship experienced rapid and sometimes radical changes, calling into question the status quo of the Euro-Mediterranean partnership. 2011 witnessed the collapse of authoritarian regimes in 3 of 5 North African countries and the destabilization of the Eastern Mediterranean geopolitical order with dramatic spillover effects. Today in Algeria and Morocco, where states thought to be stable just a few years ago, popular protests have shaken the very core of each governing political system. In Tunisia, we're confronted with an unsettling democratization process, a country where political deadlock has led to 9 governments in 9 years, and the 2019 election of a populist president hostile to the parliament. The Libyan state has fractured into rival factions. Egypt's democratization experiment collapsed, and authoritarian retrenchment there is harsh. Ongoing violence in Syria and a near socioeconomic collapse in the Sahel region has resulted in migration and refugee flows not seen since the end of the Second World War. In the future, relations between the EU and the region will be a mixed bag and probably become more political and more contentious in 2021. Perceptions of mistrust and national sovereignty will likely trump cooperation and goodwill. For meaningful reform, the EU has to work with countries to strengthen regulatory institutions, focus on ways to protect the poor and middle classes from some of the more exaggerated effects of global trade, especially in underdeveloped hinterlands. All these underlying structural issues are also underpin kind of existing priority areas of security, migration, and democracy. So these two things are not disconnected from one another in any way. The key, however, in all of this is positioning and possibly packaging. Coming from an asymmetrical position of power, the EU needs to retool how it engages the Southern Mediterranean countries in ways that are clearly seen as cooperative and mutually beneficial. The 2019 report by MEP Solé that we discussed in Barcelona together precisely highlights these stakes. Based on a combination of surveys, it engages with the very demands of the people, recognizing these demands as well as the complicated relationships, not only that these respondents, citizens, and individuals have to their respective governments, but also vis-a-vis the EU and other Western democracies are the crux of meaningful cooperation. So I believe that this can be the only way forward. And this is not just for the EU, but this is for other Western democratic and wealthier partners as well. It's the only way forward, not just for the Mediterranean neighbors, but for all those who are wary of the rise of new right-wing populism, what a combination of neoliberalism and authoritarianism can do, and also for those who are very much concerned about the lowest quintile, the poorest quintile of the world expanding significantly, especially in the last 12 years. So thank you again for asking me to comment, and I hope that some of these issues are helpful for the discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Larissa, for this really excellent and critical input. I think there is actually directly some questions flowing from your input. On the one hand, on the political economy of repression and the strengthening of authoritarianism, and on the other hand, on this very actually contentious question of social justice and what this means for EU policies in terms of trade and development. And so I have seen there are some questions already. I would add a first question, I think directly following what you said, because I think these points are important. I think on the one hand, the EU faces a dilemma and on the other a challenge. So, and I think the dilemma is the authoritarian strengthening, which is very clear across the region. Regimes are extremely becoming more and more fierce. You can see that, of course, for example, also in the case of Egypt, while the social contract is becoming more and more exclusive, it's actually becoming more limited. And now this is a dilemma for the EU, how to deal with such authoritarian states, right? Both in the context of the UFM and in the context of the neighborhood policy. I think this is a huge dilemma. If you want to cooperate, but how do you cooperate with these states? And also when we speak about it in the UFM, for example, on a more regional focus, on security, I think it's also important to always keep in mind the human security and not only speak at the regional security level, but about what does security mean on the human level for people living in the Middle East and North Africa. So that is the one thing. And then I think the other issue of social justice and socioeconomic rights raises a big challenge for EU policies, how they are currently conceptualized. And I think, I mean, Larissa, you showed this in your research. There has also been MEP who've interviewed 700 civil society organizations. And there this issue also came across. Actually, how the EU approaches development and trade has been very contested by civil society in the region. And also, for example, Raffaele De Sato worked on that in a book that is called Resisting Europe, where she works on similar issues. So I think this in research, this is repeated in several respects. And so I think this is actually a challenge. I've seen that, for example, the EU Democracy and Human Rights Action Plan now includes a socio-economic rights language, but I think I would be interested to know how the EU seeks to respond actually to this very issue. So these are questions that I would have to all speakers really already, but we already have 2 questions from the chat. The first is by Marc Furness. Thanks for the really interesting inputs. I have 3 questions for Henrike. Also, any ideas from the other panelists would be appreciated. First, is the EC taking into account the growing influence of China in the region when you are thinking about opportunities like integrating value chains and big green investment projects? And do you perceive any impact on the EU's leverage due to relations with China? Second, where do relations with North African countries stand in relation to the EU-Africa strategy and post-Cotonou? And third, 20% of the NDICI will have to be spent on human development and social inclusion. Are there already clear ideas about what this will be spent on in EMP South countries? And we have a second question by David Perejil. Good evening, everybody. This is David Perejil, Podemos International Secretariat. Thanks for organizing this very interesting webinar. I would like to answer 2 questions. Firstly, is it possible to aspire for a better coordination of foreign affairs, member states, and European Union external action? I think especially in Libya and Turkey, but it could be also necessary in other countries that are in open or long conflicts. Secondly, after 25 years of Barcelona Process and neighborhood policy in the region, don't you think we need another economic focus approach? How can we promote an economic co-development, more horizontal, in the benefit of the majorities and with gender and ecological perspective? So I think that's already 3 sets of questions. And if okay for you, I would go in the order how the speakers have been spoken. So I would start with Marc Sánchez.
Yes, well, thank you. I think I'm in a good position to answer maybe to the last question from David, which is how to improve this socioeconomic situation in the South with this cooperation that we have with them. I think that if the European Union and the UFM are able to focus on a series of key priorities that have a short and medium term important socioeconomic impact that eventually and ultimately have a huge political impact, I think this is sort of an indirect approach to tackle the issues. Of course, the social unrest, the political instability, the institutional fragility of these countries is determined as well by, among other aspects, of course, by the socioeconomic situation and by the state of the GDP, the fragility of gender equality, and more by the climate situation. So I think that if we were able to focus on these key priority areas, we might be able to improve the life of the citizens throughout concrete projects in this region, and therefore build on better conditions for political stability and social cohesion.
Thank you, Marc. Henrike?
Thank you very much, and thanks a lot for the further thoughts by Eduard and Larissa, and also all the interesting questions. Now, where to start? I mean, I'll try and do some of them from Marc in particular. I mean, China, yes, obviously. I mean, to all of this, there's always various backdrops, and of course, the growing influence of China with the Belt and Road Initiative, and also the very, let's say, assertive stance also taken in the context of the corona pandemic is, I wouldn't say of concern, but it's being noted. And I mean, as the EU often unfortunately can't really win. I mean, you know, we reprogrammed and made available for the southern neighborhood 2.3 billion euros very, very rapidly at the beginning of this year, but the feedback you get in the region is quite limited, and China sends a plane full of masks, and that is all over the news, and you always ask yourself, why is that it just frozen on the screen. Yes?
We lost you shortly. You're back, I think.
Okay, I'm back. Very good. Okay. And
yes.
You're defrozen now. Good. So China, yes, absolutely. I think nevertheless, a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and I'll come to that in a second, but also in Northern Africa and the Middle East, do realize that you know, Chinese investment comes with a number of additional challenges, particularly that it's not at all focusing on social development, the various social and human rights that were mentioned already in the discussion, and that it also quite often doesn't come with a lot of job creation. So I think that there is a lot of discussion also inside the governments of the region and inside the societies of the region, whether this is always a good idea, whilst for a long time it has been seen as you know, as a positive development. So we're looking at this very closely. A lot of the, without going into details, a lot of the announcement of investment also we realize isn't really happening that quickly, and therefore I think there's different possibilities. On the question of relation with sub-Saharan Africa, yes, I mean, clearly Africa is a big priority for this commission. North Africa is part of it, but as we know, the North African countries themselves are not necessarily seeing themselves always in the same vein, and it's always a fine line between making sure that the differences are recognized, but ensuring that the opportunities are being exploited. And some countries are very interested in investment in sub-Saharan Africa. There's trying FSD Plus, the European Fund for Sustainable Development, covers globally, but obviously all of Africa, and that gives us possibilities also to work together with the IFIs on having investments that do go across. Maybe two more things on social dimension and how we can put this into, you know, put this more into the middle of our considerations. I think it has always been very, very prominent in what the EU has been trying to do in the southern neighborhood. I mean, we're not only giving funding to, you know, through regime authorized interventions. There's a number of funding lines which are going independent of regime's approval, be it the DHR or be it regional programs which try to support particularly discussions around civil society, of social rights, of governance, independently from governance and governments, and to try to really open the space and help the space to be maintained, to have these discussions. Now, translating that into actually making governments which are indeed becoming more repressive in the region do this is an entirely different kettle of fish, and there we will have to be very, very careful also in the next couple of years to make sure that what we are providing funding for is really under the policy first principle, that first we talk about these things and then the banks come and start investing in infrastructure or huge developments in the area of the Green Deal. And I think they're very, very aware of that. One thing we also want to put a particular focus on in the upcoming communication beyond, you know, civil society role, governance and gender issues is also public finance management, because we can see that that is one of the areas where, in a mixture of lack of capacity and lack of willingness, a lot of the possibilities of better development, more sustainable development for the region are being lost, because there is just not enough control of how the budgets are being used. And that certainly will be one of the priorities in the future.
Thank you, Henrike. Edward?
Sorry, yeah, had technical problem. So on Marc's questions, and to complement what already Marc and Henrike have said, on China, what to me it's relevant when we discuss about China or the role of other actors like Russia or the Gulf countries, in this discussion about which vision for the Mediterranean shall we have as Europeans, is the understanding that we've lost a little bit the monopoly of conditionality if we ever had it, in a way, and that and to assume it in a way, but also we should also be clear to our partners in the South when they tell us, you are imposing conditionality on us. They also do impose conditionality on the European Union in a non-written form when we talk about cooperation on migration, on fight against terrorism, and so on. So this sempiternal question of conditionality, I think, in a way, not only because of this new multipolar Mediterranean, but also because of, as I said, the fact that we've become weaker, and then our partners can put conditionality on us, I mean, needs to be rethought when we are trying to create this new vision for the Mediterranean. On Africa, here, I think that this is an interesting element. I mean, that's part also of two research I conducted. One talking to European diplomats, to people like Henrike or Marc, those that are working on the neighborhood south, that they told me that sometimes when they speak to the top leadership, to ministers, to prime ministers, and you try to convince them to work on the Mediterranean, it's far more difficult than when you try to make them work on African affairs. Because Africa, it seems, the land of opportunities, as where everything could happen, the train not to miss. So in a way, I'm thinking, and this is something I've been thinking for a while, to what extent can we profit from this African enthusiasm to link a little bit more the Mediterranean into it? Because certainly there will be no EU-Africa bicontinental future if the Mediterranean is a gray zone or a dark zone. I mean, this is the nexus between Europe and Africa. So if we Europeans, if our prime ministers and ministers, top leadership, believe that Africa matters, the Mediterranean should matter then, because this is the evident point of connection between the two continents. On what the bid said, yes, indeed, the issue of lack of coordination, even sometimes hostility among member states doesn't help. There have been some improvements, however, also, I should say. I mean, now it's a bit difficult to elaborate on why and whether this could be sustained, and we shall be a bit more optimistic for 2021. But just to a point is that when the EU member states are not coordinated among themselves, this is a moment that also external actors profit from, trying to bring some member states closer to their agendas. And we've seen that, for instance, in competition in Africa, when it comes to the France-Emirati relations, but also the Turkish strategies with some EU member states. So really here, I mean, avoiding competition and hostility among member states, I'd say it's key. And I couldn't agree more with all what you have said about inequalities and social justice. This is the big topic that what I was trying to say with remembering the anniversary of 2020, 2011. Also because COVID has only amplified the inequalities we already had. North, South, inside each of the societies, youth versus all generations, and also obviously the issue of gender and the territorial inequalities that Larissa was mentioning between the territories that are connected globally and those that are left behind.
Many thanks, Edward, for important points raised also on EU-Africa. I just wanted to add something shortly on conditionality, because I think this has been very much in the media the last 2-3 days with what happened with Macron, who actually invited Sisi to France after 3 human rights lawyers or activists had actually been imprisoned. And so the question, conditionality or not, I mean, do we still have any leverage? But I think more than that, maybe for Europeans, it needs to be a question, is this the European Union, which also consists of its member states that we want to be. So I think it's not only a question of conditionality, but also what kind of an identity do we want to have as Europeans. So I just wanted to add this because I think it's a really important issue also for how the European neighborhood policy will continue. And with this, I would turn to Larissa. And Larissa, if I can ask a third question to you, which has just come up by Dimitrios Kavouras. Can the current Eurocentric approach bring expected results for cooperation and democratization in the MENA region?
Okay. So very briefly, the authoritarianism question you brought up, Daniela, is really important because the authoritarianism, the resurgence of authoritarianism that we saw starting in 2013, is a very different kind of authoritarian rule. It's a lot more violent, it's a lot more repressive, it's a lot more functioning, if you will, whether it's post-quashing movements that we're calling for democracy, a different version of democracy. They're not necessarily liberal democracies that they're asking for, but also post-conflict. So I think untangling that in any kind of policy is important. So it's not necessarily about whether, it's not, I mean, of course, it's a question of conditionality, but just understanding how these regimes are functioning is really important because they function differently today than they did 10 years ago. In terms of the democratization question, I believe that the democracy can be aided, but it cannot be brought about. So what was clear in 2010 and 2011 in the region is it was a real test for, if you will, for the potentiality of the people. And of course, there's a lot of nostalgia for previous regimes and nostalgia for even less violent authoritarian conditions or more stable non-democratic conditions. But it's those conditions that can be aided, but not necessarily the ability of people to achieve what they achieved in 2010 and 2011, and that lasted through 2013. So democracy assistance and democratization through external actors is very different than pushing for a sovereign project.
Thank you so much, Larissa. I don't see any further questions. I don't know if any of the speakers has last thoughts on issues that have been raised in this last round to which you would like to still react. Yes, please, Henrike.
No, thank you. Thanks a lot. Just very briefly, because indeed I didn't answer two questions. Just very technically, Marc was asking whether the 10%, the 20% target for human development is related to certain areas or not, but it's across, and obviously it will also be therefore relevant in the part that's going to be implemented in North Africa and the Middle East, so in the southern neighborhood. And then maybe just, and that's kind of the final remark on working with the southern neighborhood, and it's a bit related to the frustration of dealing with member states who say one thing in the EU and another thing at home, and yet another thing when they're on a trip to countries in the region where they're trying to make business deals, etc. It's obviously not the same discourse. But I think you know, if you work in this region, you have to have a pretty high level of being able to deal with frustration anyway. But it always goes on afterwards. It's never the end of the discussion. And if at least you manage that in some areas, in some countries, in some sectors, in some discussions, you can turn it around. You can turn it into the right direction and then work incrementally in the hope that somehow things will come together and at least some aspects are being improved. Certainly not at all what wouldn't be needed, and for everybody, but at least some aspects. I think that's definitely worth the effort, and this is why we continue to make it, and this is why we definitely will continue to make it in the future, in the hope that we don't get, as Eduard was rightly saying, then a complete change of plan because something completely different happens. But even then, I mean, there's only one way forward, and we'll try to continue to go that.
Yeah, many thanks, Henrike, and really to all of you. I think this has been an excellent discussion. And actually, I think it is to be continued, Ernest and Jordi, right? I think this should be continued. For example, I think one question we have less touched upon today is the issue of which Marc previously mentioned, of a regional security community. And now we speak more about regional security architecture. And of course, this cannot be something European, it needs to be something shared. So I think maybe the next time we meet, we can more go to this issue and yeah, regional conflicts which continue, which are in the direct neighborhood of the European Union, and to which the European Union also needs to find an answer. So I have noted a lot of questions for me. It's really difficult for me to do a synthesis of this, because I think there is a lot of reflections which we still need to do. But I hope that actually, Jordi, that you can do a synthesis of this and give us some closing remarks. The floor is yours. Thank you.
I'll try. Thank you very much, Daniela. In only 5 minutes, it will be rather difficult, but nevertheless, I'll try. First of all, I'm very happy to have followed this very interesting discussion. Over 1.5 years ago, we had similar discussions with some of you when we released a study, and we presented it in Brussels and Barcelona on the southern neighborhood. And somehow we are tackling again more or less the same issues. I'm happy that the 25th anniversary of the Barcelona process has caused a surge in webinars on this topic, and also a surge in discussions, because this is really a very important topic for the whole Mediterranean region. Because I think if we now would go out to the street from the places where each of us are right now, and would ask to the people, what image comes to your mind when I say Mediterranean? I think probably many people would ask crowded boats sinking, people drowning, a battleground for migration between people trying to get to Europe and others trying to prevent these people getting to Europe. So this would be the image, at least certainly, that people would give to us, to Marc, Eduardo, and me, speaking from Barcelona, and probably for the rest of you. And probably people would also think of the Mediterranean as a huge divide, not as a sea that brings together, people and cultures and economies, but probably one of the hugest divides in the world in terms of economic disparities, socio-economic disparities, and political realities, and even mindsets. Though we are not that far away, physically speaking, the both shores of the Mediterranean are not that far away. I think we all could agree, if I try to summarize one of the messages that you have given to us, which would be, well, our assessment of the first 25 years of the Barcelona process cannot be very much positive, because the outcomes didn't fulfill by far most of our expectations. That's a reality. But some of you also you are sensing like a kind of political momentum that should help should do a boost in this Euro-Mediterranean relations. Well, I hope you are right. Those of you that are more optimistic about this momentum, I really hope you are right. But I want to say it very clearly. Celebrating an anniversary doesn't build per se a momentum. I mean, it's good celebrating landmarks in Euro-Mediterranean relations, but we need much more than that. But much more than celebrating an anniversary. We need, as has been said, much more political will and ambition. There is a lot to do to improve relationships between the two shores of the Mediterranean and between the EU and the MENA countries, not for the sake of having friendly relations, which is always positive in the diplomatic world, but mainly for the sake of the peoples living in this area, especially on the southern shores where the situation is more difficult. And yes, we have to take into account the aspirations of political and economic inclusivity of people everywhere, but again, especially in the south. And I think when it comes to ambition from the EU side, I think this is very much related to the debate about what kind of role does the EU wants to play in the world, because it depends on what we answer to that question, the degree of ambition that we are going to deploy in our relations with the rest of the world, and of course also with our neighbors. And it's not only a matter of willingness. Yes, we are convinced that we want to be a key actor in the world, at least a strong regional actor, but it's also a matter of the instruments and the means we have to try to become this relevant actor in the world. And here we have a problem that has already also been mentioned. There are many parallel behaviors within the EU when it comes to the relations with the rest of the world, and especially with our neighbors, both in the east and the south. So we need to improve also a lot in the EU when it comes to how do we want to become a relevant actor in the world and for our neighbors. And we should focus more on the real needs of the people, on the aspirations of people in the neighborhood, in our neighborhood, to have a decent life and decent living conditions. And I know this is more easy to say than to accomplish, but at least politically speaking, this should be a goal that we should never ever forget. Well, I want to conclude. I want to thank a lot all the panelists for having had this very fruitful and interesting debate, which, as Daniela was proposing, has to be continued. There are still many open debates and questions and issues to be approached. So I'm open to that. Thanks also for all of you that have been following us this afternoon. Thanks to Ernest for proposing me to co-host this webinar, and thanks to the staff that has managed to put together this wonderful panel, and especially to Laura Batalla. So that's it. That's all from my side. It's 3 minutes later than the time we should be closing. So once again, thank you very much for your participation, and have a nice afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.